I'm sure you know what a conflict is. If you feel like you haven't been in one, you've at least witnessed one. You might even be one of those types of people that likes to start them. But when we look at conflict in literature, we're talking about how a character or different characters in a text have a problem, the conflict, with someone or something else. Conflicts can be identified as either internal or external, and there are 5 types. So let's check them out. The first and most common type of conflict is a character versus character conflict. And this could be any combination of a single character versus a group versus a single character, or a group versus a group. It is an external conflict, and like I said, it's the most common. Nearly any piece of literature isn't going to involve some sort of character versus character conflict. If you look at these examples, you see some character versus character conflicts, and in the bottom right corner, you see a group versus group, character versus character conflict. You have the athletes or the jocks versus the nerds. And I'm going to bring this up a little bit later in the video. A second type of conflict is the character versus self conflict. This is the only type of internal conflict. And this is when the character has a problem or conflict with him or herself. Some examples of this type of conflict would be an emotional conflict, sort of like what Katniss had between Peeta and Gale. A cognitive conflict where you can't make a decision. You see this man here with the devil and the angel trying to help him make a decision. Psychological conflicts such as addiction, or in the case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you had a split personality, or it could just be something as simple as a physical injury. Next we have character versus society. This is again an external conflict, and this occurs when a character struggles against some sort of social system. It could be cultural or traditional values, social norms or expectations, or stereotypes. I've given some examples of what it might look like in a text. It could be poverty, some sort of conflict with the police or justice system, the military, the education system, or religion. These are not the only types, but they are the most common. The 3 pictures you see here show some examples of different character versus society conflicts. Mean Girls is, by the way, a character versus character conflict, but also something within those social norms or cultural norms. The whole idea or concept of Mean Girls, the stereotype of Mean Girls in a school, creates a character versus society conflict. Annie had conflicts with poverty. She also had a conflict with the fact that she was an orphan, which is part of the social services system. So that would be character versus society. And the bottom picture is from the Shawshank Redemption, where the characters have a character versus the justice system conflict. Character versus nature conflict is also fairly common. This again is an external conflict when the character or characters have a conflict or struggle with some sort of natural element. It could be a force of nature, a natural disaster, animals, especially a wild animal, and sometimes we would consider disease or sickness an element of nature as well. So these are some familiar examples. I'm sure everybody knows The Wizard of Oz. Dorothy deals with the conflict of the tornado. In The Perfect Storm, the characters are in conflict with a storm while they're all on a ship out at sea. In The Revenant, the main character has many character versus nature conflicts, and the picture shows just one where he is attacked by a bear. And if you're familiar with The Life of Pi, the main character again deals with multiple character versus nature conflicts. He's sort of stranded out at sea in a lifeboat with a number of wild animals that were on a ship with him. So he needs to try to survive these wild animals on the ship and also find a way to land. Character versus fate can be a tough one. First, you have to know what fate is, and the best way to describe it is that it's like destiny. It's the idea that things were meant to happen to someone. Now, if you think about literature as something that a person sat down and wrote, then everything that happens to a character was meant to happen. The author chose for those things to happen in a certain way. But in real life, these might be considered acts of God. Popular examples would be getting married, finding your soulmate would be fate. Often we think of babies being born or people dying as fate. Some other examples could be those natural disasters. If a natural disaster destroys something, some people might look at that as destiny or fate. This is, again, an external conflict, all right? And character versus fate is when a character struggles with their path, their destiny, what it is they were born or charged or supposed to be doing with their life. You see this a lot in mythology or adventure movies, fantasy. It's very common in fantasy and science fiction. And you see here some of the examples. Luke Skywalker struggles with his destiny quite a bit in having to become a Jedi, having to face his father, having to accept that Darth Vader's his father. All of those things he has a hard time dealing with. Frodo Baggins, just like Bilbo in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, both struggle with their fate, having to, return that ring to Mordor and overcome all of those obstacles along the way, very much go against his character. And Elsa, I'm sure you remember, I'm sure you know from Frozen, also struggles with her fate when she discovers this sort of power that she has of creating snow and making things cold. She struggles at first with how to manage that and how to live with that and still be a good sister and that sort of thing. So some final notes and thoughts on conflict. First thing, you may have noticed that some conflicts in a story can be categorized as more than one type. If you remember, there was the jocks versus nerds, character versus character conflict. We could also categorize that as a character versus society conflict, because the whole concept or idea of jocks as athletes being one group, they're one stereotypical group, versus nerds as another stereotypical group, they're groups that are part of a culture or society, then we could consider those more than one type of a conflict. When you encounter situations like this, it's important to sit and think about how the author has developed each of those types, given that it's one problem or one struggle, but the fact that it meets two different types, that's probably indicating something significant to you. A second thing is that conflicts always involve one or more characters, and they are directly connected to a character's label as either round or flat or dynamic and static. We've already reviewed characterization. Most likely, if you have a character in the text that has a conflict, they're probably a round character. Flat characters may be involved with a conflict, but it's not their particular conflict. The text of the book, the descriptions does not describe or examine how that character is dealing with that conflict. Another way that you can use conflict to help you with characterization is if your character overcomes the conflict at some point in the text, it is most likely that your character is dynamic. Most people, as a result of resolving conflicts, undergo some sort of change, and that's what a dynamic character does. Lastly, when it comes to analyzing conflict, you really need to go beyond just identifying the type. That is the first step, being able to say whether you think it is a character versus character or character versus nature, character versus society conflict. But you really need to consider how the author developed that conflict and why they did it in that way. Especially, again, those conflicts that might be categorized as more than one type. But really examine, what are the details or things that actually happened around that conflict? How did it come to be? How was it resolved? And, once it was resolved, was there any other repercussion or anything else that happened as a result of it? The next thing that we'll do is look also at how conflicts have impacts or have some sort of effect on other elements of literature in the text. We've already sort of made a connection here to conflict with characterization, and later in our unit we're going to connect conflict to plot and conflict to a theme. All right, so that's another thing. When you're analyzing conflict, you want to try to make these different types of connections.